वेरी गुड इवनिंग टू ऑल। दिस साइड रूबी आहूजा एंड हम लोग आज डिस्कस करने जा रहे हैं गोल्ड मार्केट के फ्लक्चुएशंस के बारे में और देखेंगे आज के डेटास। सो डिस्कस करने से पहले फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल लेट मी नो आप लोग को मेरी आवाज़ क्लियर है और स्क्रीन प्रॉपरली विजिबल है। इफ बोथ थिंग्स आर क्लियर काइंडली प्रेस 1 ताकि हम लोग आज का सेशन यहाँ से स्टार्ट कर सकें। ओके सो गोल्ड के मूव को हम लोग देखते हैं तो हम लोग सबसे पहले 15 मिनट कैंडल पे आते हैं। 15 मिनट कैंडल हमारी 1740 के लेवल्स पे और पूरी तरीके से अपसाइड राइज करती हुई दिख रही है 1740 1741 के लेवल्स पे। एक बुल ग्रीन कैंडल का फॉर्मेशन दिखाती हुई वापस से लगातार हम लोग के मार्केट में तेजी आती हुई दिख रही है 1729 के लेवल से। आज हम लोग को मार्केट में पूरे दिन गिरावट देखने को मिली और जितनी गिरावट देखने को मिली हम लोग को शाम के सेशन में पूरे कवर अप होते हुए दिखे हैं और फिलहाल 1740 के आसपास मार्केट मूव करती हुई। उम्मीद हमारी है कि एक बार 1740 के लेवल से 38 तक के लेवल्स देखने को मिले। 38 37 के लेवल्स मार्केट के रेडार पे, बट अभी मार्केट एक बार अपसाइड स्पाइक मारती हुई 1 मिनट कैंडल पे आ जाएंगे तो 1 मिनट कैंडल पूरी तरीके से अपसाइड 1740.6973 के लेवल्स पे। सोच समझ के कोई पोजीशन कैरी करेंगे, अदरवाइज नहीं करेंगे। तो हम लोग यहाँ से जो पोजीशन कैरी करने जा रहे हैं वो अपना कॉन्ट्रैक्ट शॉर्ट करेंगे। तो हम लोगों ने अपना कॉन्ट्रैक्ट शॉर्ट किया हुआ है 1740 के लेवल्स पे और हमारी उम्मीद प्राइजेस के डाउन साइड जाने की 1739.83 तक के लेवल्स बनते हुए मार्केट के रेडार पे और उम्मीद करते जल्दी हमारी पोजीशन प्रॉफिट साइड आती हुई दिखेगी। सेवनटीन 38.93 1739 के लेवल्स पे प्राइजेस मूव करते हुए देखने को मिल रहा है। एक दूसरी ग्रीन कैंडल 1739 के लेवल्स पे देख सकते हैं। 7 बजे हमारी मार्केट एक बार वापस से डाउन साइड आती हुई दिख रही है। 7:02 हो चुके हैं और जैसे कि मार्केट ने जितनी तेजी दिखाई थी वापस से एक बार करेक्शन की उम्मीद और प्राइजेस करेक्ट करते हुए 1738.75 78 के लेवल्स पे पूरी तरीके से करेक्शन के साथ। कह नहीं सकते मार्केट कितनी नीचे जाएगी क्योंकि हो सकता है यहाँ से एक बार वापस से अपसाइड अप्रोच कर जाए और हो सकता है एक बार वापस से करेक्शन देखने को मिले तो हम लोग अपनी पोजीशन जो प्रॉफिट साइड है यहाँ से क्लियर कर लेंगे। तो हम लोगों ने अपनी एक पोजीशन ऑलरेडी प्रॉफिट साइड क्लियर कर लिया 2 मिनट के अंदर क्योंकि मार्केट का मूव बहुत अच्छा था। 2 कॉन्ट्रैक्ट शॉर्ट किए हुए थे 1739.95 के लेवल्स पे और वापस से उसको बाय किया हुआ है 1738.92 के लेवल्स पे। दैट इज जो प्रॉफिट्स होते हुए देखे $206 के प्रॉफिट हम लोगों ने जनरेट कर लिया और मार्केट एक बार वापस से 1739 के लेवल्स पे आप लोग को देखने को मिल रही है। यानी कि हम लोगों ने सही टाइम पे पोजीशन क्लियर की है, अपनी कैरी भी की और क्लियर भी की है। थोड़ी देर मार्केट का मूव देखते हैं क्योंकि हो सकता है एक और पोजीशन बनाने का सही टाइम मिल जाए। अगर करेक्शन आती है तो 1735 के भी लेवल्स हम लोग को मार्केट के रेडार पे देखने को मिल सकते हैं, बट उसके पहले 1737 जो है एक बहुत अच्छा वी कैन से सपोर्ट लेवल जो कि मार्केट में ट्रेस करके वापस से मार्केट एक बार अपसाइड जाती हुई दिख सकती है। 38 के लेवल्स को पूरी तरीके से ब्रेक करते हुए 1739.1629 के लेवल्स पे प्राइजेस मूव करते हुए फिलहाल 37 के लेवल्स पे आते हुए 37 के लेवल से एक बुल ग्रीन कैंडल 1 मिनट कैंडल फॉर्मेशन का टाइम 1738 तक के लेवल्स देखने को मिले मार्केट की रेडार पे। 1737.7993 कह नहीं सकते इस टाइम का मोमेंट किस तरीके का होगा, क्योंकि एशियन मार्केट की ओपनिंग का टाइम है और मार्केट किसी भी साइड रिवर्स लेती हुई दिख सकती है। थोड़ी देर मार्केट को ट्रेस करेंगे, उसके बाद देखेंगे कि कैसी पोजीशन अगर बनती है तो लेंगे, अदरवाइज हम लोग आगे डिस्कस करेंगे अपने न्यूज़ सेक्शन को, अपने पॉइंट्स को। वापस से एक बार करेक्शन 1736.99, 1736.80 के लेवल्स। 15 मिनट कैंडल पे आएंगे तो 15 मिनट कैंडल डाउन होती है 1736.82 के लेवल्स पे मूव करते हुए फिलहाल। प्राइजेस पूरी तरह से जितनी अपनी अपसाइड मूवमेंट बनाए थे पूरी तरीके से वापस से करेक्ट होती हुई दिख रही है। इस टाइम मूव काफ़ी अच्छा होता है तो हम लोग थोड़ी देर मूव देख रहे हैं इसीलिए मार्केट का। हम लोगों ने ऑल्दो अपनी पोजीशन क्लियर कर ली है और अभी हम लोग वेट कर रहे हैं मार्केट के मूव देखने का पूरी तरीके से। सेवनटीन 35 तक के लेवल्स लगातार 5 पॉइंट की गिरावट के साथ मार्केट देखने को मिली है एक ही कैंडल में हम लोग को। जितनी तेजी लास्ट 15 मिनट्स में बनाई थी उतनी ही गिरावट देखने को मिल रही है मार्केट में। सेवनटीन 34.8, 1734.9 के लेवल्स। इस कैंडल के क्लोज होने का वेट करेंगे और उसके बाद उम्मीद है कि हम लोग एक बाय साइड पोजीशन पे बैठे। वन मिनट कैंडल का मूव देखे तो वन मिनट कैंडल लगातार डाउन साइड आती है 1734.81, 1735 के लेवल। पूरी तरह से डाउन और हम लोग अपनी पोजीशन एक यहाँ से बाय बाय मार्केट करने को सोच रहे हैं। हम लोगों ने वापस से अपनी एक पोजीशन को बाय बाय मार्केट किया हुआ है। इस उम्मीद में कि प्राइसेस एक बार अपसाइड मूव लेते हुए दिखेंगे क्लोजिंग के टाइम तक, इस कैंडल की क्लोजिंग के टाइम तक। 1734.1928 के लेवल्स पे प्राइसेस मूव करते हुए पूरी तरीके से करेक्शन के साथ हम लोगों ने अपनी एक और पोजीशन कैरी की हुई है जो कि अपने दो कॉन्ट्रैक्ट बाय किए हुए 1734.48 के लेवल्स पे। 1735.1317 के लेवल्स। हमारी पोजीशन वापस से प्रॉफिट में, और हम लोग इस पोजीशन को यहीं से क्लियर कर लेंगे। तो हम लोगों ने वापस से अपनी एक और पोजीशन क्लियर किया, देख सकते हैं 1734.48 के लेवल्स पे बाय किया, 1735.99 पे सेल करके हम लोगों ने अपने $302 प्रॉफिट जनरेट किया। अब वापस से एक बार मार्केट करेक्ट करती हुई दिख रही है। हम लोगों ने सही टाइम पे अपनी पोजीशन क्लियर की है। 7 से 7:15 की मार्केट बहुत अच्छी मूव करती है, जिसमें हम लोगों ने अपनी 2 पोजीशन बहुत अच्छे प्रॉफिट्स के साथ क्लियर किया। आई होप आप लोगों ने क्लियर कर ली होगी। हम लोग इतना ध्यान इसीलिए दे रहे हैं क्योंकि इस टाइम हम लोग की एशियन सेशन ओपन होती हुई दिखती है, और उस टाइम पे मार्केट का मूव देखना बहुत जरूरी है, और प्रॉफिट जनरेट करने के हिसाब से बहुत अच्छा टाइम। सेवनटीन 34.8588 के लेवल्स। इस कैंडल को पूरी तरीके से फॉर्म होने देंगे और उसके बाद अपने न्यू सेक्शन पे आएंगे। हमारा पहला सेशन जो है पूरी तरीके से डिपेंड होता है मार्केट के सिनेरियोज पे और मार्केट के मोमेंट पे, और उससे हम लोग प्रॉफिट जनरेट करते हैं। नेक्स्ट सेशन हम लोग न्यूज़ सेक्शन और डिवाइड करते हैं कि कौन कौन से डेटास रिलीज हुए हैं उस बेसिस पे। सेवनटीन 34.6761 के लेवल। दो मिनट बाद कैंडल की क्लोजिंग का टाइम। थर्टी फोर के भी लेवल्स को ब्रेक करते हुए मार्केट एक बार वापस से डाउन स्विंग दिखाते हुए देखने को मिल रही है। सेवनटीन 33 तक के लेवल्स, प्राइजेस पूरी तरीके से करेक्शन दिखाते हुए। एक मिनट बाद इस कैंडल की क्लोजिंग का टाइम, और प्राइजेस पूरी तरीके से करेक्शन दिखाते हुए मिले 1733 के लेवल्स पे। ओके, प्राइसेस पूरी तरीके से डाउन 1732.2835 के लेवल्स पे, और पूरी तरीके से करेक्शन दिखाते हुए दिख रहे 1731.4347 के लेवल्स पे करेक्ट होते हुए पूरी तरीके से डाउन। पूरी उम्मीद कर रहे हैं एक बार अपसाइड सिग्नल देने की, थोड़ा सा अपसाइड मोमेंट हम लोग वापस से उम्मीद करें मार्केट से 1732-435 तक के लेवल्स की उम्मीद है। वापस से थोड़े से रेड सिग्नल बनाती हुई प्राइसेस करेक्शन के साथ 1732.1526 के लेवल्स पे मूव करते हुए फिलहाल। वापस से करेक्शन 1731.6660। 1 मिनट कैंडल पे आते तो 1 मिनट कैंडल पूरी तरीके से डाउन आती हुई 1731.5459 के लेवल्स पे। उम्मीद करें एक बार अपसाइड सिग्नल की 1732-33 तक के लेवल्स की उम्मीद कर रहे हैं हम लोग मार्केट से एक बार। प्राइसेस पूरी तरीके से करेक्ट होते हुए एक दूसरी कैंडल फॉर्मेशन 1731.2617 और 1730 के लेवल्स को टच करते हुए हम लोग उम्मीद करें 30s के लेवल्स को टच करते हुए एक बार मार्केट अपसाइड आती हुई दिखे। थोड़ी देर मार्केट का मूव देखते हैं और फिर हम लोग अपने न्यूज सेक्शन पे आते हैं। थोड़े से अपसाइड रिबाउंड लेते हुए 1732.5667 के लेवल्स। वापस से करेक्शन दिखाते हुए 1731.4547 के लेवल्स पे 5 मिनट कैंडल स्टिल डाउन। हमारी उम्मीद है एक बार अपसाइड मूव करते हुए वापस से डाउन साइड आती हुई दिखेगी। 1732 के लेवल्स बनते हुए उम्मीद करें एक बार मूव दिखाते हुए 33 तक के लेवल्स दिखाते हुए मिले मार्केट 1733 हमारे टारगेट है। उम्मीद करते हैं 1733 के लेवल्स देखने को मिले। वापस से करेक्शन 1731.2213 के लेवल्स पे प्राइसेस पूरी तरीके से करेक्शन के साथ वेट करेंगे थोड़ी देर इस कैंडल के फॉर्मेशन का, इस 5 मिनट कैंडल फॉर्मेशन का। हो सकता है नेक्स्ट कैंडल होती हुई दिखे हमें। दूसरी कैंडल फॉर्मेशन 1730.5 to 53 के लेवल्स पे। सेवनटीन 30.4630 के लेवल्स बनते हुए प्राइसेस पूरी तरीके से करेक्शन के साथ। हमारी अभी भी उम्मीद $2-3 ऊपर और प्राइसेस 1733 तक के लेवल्स दिखाते हुए मिले। $17.29 तक के लेवल्स बनते हुए मार्केट पूरी तरीके से करेक्ट होती हुई 15 मिनट कैंडल स्टिल डाउन 1729.97 1730 के लेवल्स पे। उम्मीद करें 30 के लेवल स्टेबल करते हुए मार्केट एक बार अपसाइड रिबाउंड करती हुई दिखे। हमारी अभी भी उम्मीद 1730 के लेवल्स को स्टेबल करती हुई मार्केट एक बार अपसाइड रिबाउंड करती हुई दिखे। 1733 तक के लेवल्स की हमारी उम्मीद है मार्केट से। थोड़े से अपसाइड रिबाउंड 1731.5857 के लेवल्स। सेवनटीन 32 के लेवल 1733 तक के लेवल्स हम लोग को देखने को मिल रहे हैं, जो कि हमारी उम्मीदें थी पूरी तरीके से मार्केट से एक बार थोड़े से अपसाइड रिबाउंड दिखाते हुए मिली। लेकिन अभी भी मोमेंटम हम लोग को डाउन का ही लग रहा है आज का मार्केट का, क्योंकि पूरी तरीके से मार्केट आज डाउन रही है हमारी। बस 6 मिनट इस कैंडल के क्लोज होने का टाइम, और उसके बाद हम लोग डिस्कस करेंगे अपने न्यूज़ सेक्शन को। देख सकते हैं मार्केट एक बार अपसाइड रिबाउंड लेती है 1732.8485 के लेवल्स पे। वापस से थोड़े से करेक्शन के साथ इस कैंडल की क्लोजिंग का वेट करें। जैसे ही क्लोजिंग देखने को मिलेगी हम लोग आ जाएंगे अपने न्यूज़ सेक्शन को डिस्कस करने। 1732.6162 के लेवल्स पे प्राइजेस वही स्टेबल होते हुए दिख रहे हैं। 1733 के लेवल्स पे और एक थोड़े से अपसाइड रिबाउंड बनाती हुई बुल ग्रीन कैंडल फॉर्मेशन। देख सकते हैं पूरी तरीके से मार्केट स्टेबल होती है 1733 के लेवल्स पे। पूरी तरीके से अपसाइड रिबाउंड लेती है 1735 के लिए रेडी होती है हमारी मार्केट। 1734.3738 के लेवल्स पे फिलहाल मूव करते हुए उम्मीद करें एक बार 1735 के लेवल्स को टच कर सकती है वापस से। पूरी तरह से रिबाउंड लेती हुई मार्केट 1735.3436 के लेवल्स पे मूव करते हुए एक अपसाइड रिबाउंड के साथ। इस टाइम मार्केट का मूवमेंट जज करना थोड़ा सा मुश्किल हो रहा है, इसलिए हम लोग जब भी कोई सेशन ओपनिंग होती है उसी टाइम पे अपने ट्रेड्स लेना ज़्यादा पसंद करते हैं। 2 मिनट बाद इस कैंडल की भी क्लोजिंग का टाइम। देख सकते हैं पूरे दिन भर से मार्केट क्रैश किया आज हमारी 1754 का हाई बनाते हुए और 1727 तक का लो बनाती हुई दिखी है। और फिलहाल अब थोड़ी सी तेजी देखने को मिली है मार्केट में एशियन सेशन की ओपनिंग के साथ। सेवनटीन थर्टी फाइव एक बहुत अच्छा रेजिस्टेंस जिसको मार्केट एक बार टच करके वापस से आती हुई दिख रही है 1734.6253 के लेवल्स पे मूव करते हुए फिलहाल। 1734.4843 के लेवल्स पे मूव करते हुए मार्केट एक बार पूरी तरीके से स्टेबिलिटी के साथ 1 मिनट के बाद इस कैंडल की भी क्लोजिंग का टाइम होने वाला है। ओके, सो हमारी एक दूसरी कैंडल फॉर्मेशन 1734.4925 के लेवल्स पे फुल ग्रीन कैंडल फॉर्मेशन उम्मीद कर रहे हैं हम लोग यहाँ से। ओके, स्टिल करेक्शन 1733.4445 के लेवल्स पे। थोड़ी सी करेक्शन के साथ इस कैंडल की ओपनिंग का टाइम 1733.4245 के लेवल्स पे अभी थोड़ी सी करेक्शन दिखाती हुई उम्मीद करते हैं कि क्लोजिंग तक एक बार अपसाइड रिबाउंड करती हुई देखने को मिल सकती है, पॉसिबिलिटी है। अगर मोमेंट डाउन रहा तो डाउन भी आ सकती है, क्योंकि इस टाइम मार्केट का मोमेंट जज करना बहुत ही मुश्किल हो जाता है। 1733.1009 के लेवल थोड़ी सी करेक्शन दिखाते हुए प्राइजेस एक शॉर्ट रेड कैंडल के साथ मूवमेंट दिखाते हुए, लेकिन उम्मीद है कि एक बार अपसाइड रिबाउंड करती हुई देखने को मिलेगी। फिलहाल 1733.7665 के लेवल्स। वापस से थोड़े से अपसाइड रिबाउंड और 1734 जैसे कि हम लोगों ने एक्सपेक्ट किया था कि एक बार अपसाइड रिबाउंड देखने को मिल सकती है, तो अगर 1734 को ट्रेस कर जाता है तो 1736 के टारगेट्स वापस से हम लोग एक्सपेक्ट कर सकते हैं मार्केट से। 1734.02 1733.98 अभी तक 1734 के लेवल्स को स्टे नहीं कर पा रही है मार्केट, लेकिन अभी 3 मिनट हुआ है इस कैंडल की ओपनिंग को। ओके, वापस से एक बार अपसाइड रिबाउंड, शॉर्ट ग्रीन कैंडल फॉर्मेशन, प्राइसेस पूरी तरीके से अपसाइड राइज करने के लिए रेडी। देख सकते हैं रिबाउंड लेती हुई 1735 के लेवल्स बनाते हुए फिलहाल मार्केट 1735.5351 के लेवल्स। जैसे कि एक्सपेक्टेशन थी, प्राइसेस एक बार अपसाइड रिबाउंड करते हुए दिख रहे हैं। 1736 तक के टारगेट्स बना चुके हैं, जैसे कि हम लोगों ने कहा था 35 के लेवल्स ब्रेक होते हैं तो 37 तक के लेवल्स देखने को मिल सकते हैं। अभी 36 के लेवल्स को ट्रेस कर चुकी है मार्केट और हम लोग की उम्मीद है 1736 के 37 के एक बार जैसे हम लोग को 37 के टारगेट्स देखने को मिलते हैं, हम लोग उसके बाद अपने न्यूज़ सेक्शन पे आते हैं डिस्कस करने। आज के डेटास और आज की न्यूज़। $1736.4950 के लेवल्स। $50 और हमारे लेवल्स एक बार अपसाइड रिबाउंड करते हुए दिखेंगे 1737 के टारगेट्स। सो प्राइजेस 1732 के लेवल्स पे वापस से एक बार आते हुए दिख रहे हैं, अपसाइड मूव करते हुए वापस से एक बार करेक्शन। 1732.6558 के लेवल्स पे हम लोग आ जाते हैं अपने न्यूज़ सेक्शन पे। सो हम लोग सबसे पहले गोल्ड न्यूज़ किटको के बारे में डिस्कस करेंगे और एक क्लिप देखेंगे मार्केट की, जैसे कि हम लोग डेली देखते हैं। ये क्लिप देखेंगे हम लोग 5 मिनट की।
After rallying for 3 straight sessions to fall back down Wednesday morning, gold is now looking to reverse its fate here after the release of the Fed minutes. Frank Holmes, Chief Executive Officer for U.S. Global Investors, joins us now. Frank, good to see you again.
Good to be with you.
Yeah, gold off its lows, but still down on the day, trading around $12.90 here an ounce, still below the key 1300 level. Frank, what's it going to take for gold to not lose momentum here?
It's all it has to do with these 2-year, 5-year interest rates and real interest rates. And the big action this week is going to be CPI numbers. Last was 1.9, and if the 5-year government bond is trading a yield, offering a yield above or below that, it will move gold around. Now, the FOMC meetings, like there's these quant funds that read sentiment and words and they do word counting, etc., but they can change in a dime comparing it to other meetings. So this initial flurry is just difficult to digest and not confuse you.
But it's like gold can't keep the rally going.
Yeah, it's amazing that it's what it is. I think that the governments around the central banks, the G20 bankers, are manipulating interest rates. It's very evident. They can play games from 30-year mortgages or 2-year, 5-year, whatever they're doing. And what's really shocking is just the percentage that sort of Swiss, South Korea, and Japan are buying stocks in their own market. They create paper of nowhere, and to make it look all good, they can suppress the price of gold, but they can only do it so long. But there is something going on this massive amount of printing of money, buying stocks, and gold being where it is. It just doesn't make sense.
So, Frank,
So
are you
I would
saying the
bet on the
gold
upside.
market is manipulated?
I would say that it's smoothed out. There's no doubt. Well, there is a mechanism of playing with bond market. There is a mechanism of moving. Is that it's more balanced in disclosure. They say that now we're going to be focused on 30-year or 20-year or 10-year, and bonds all adapt and adjust, and then the government comes in and buys those bonds, and they move interest rates around. So there's no doubt that they could do this with gold, and there's been just too much litigation on the manipulation that takes place by traders. So there's something that's just not there that can intuitively make sense to the gold market this short period.
Okay, well, another part of that equation that you brought up in a recent article of yours, Frank, is you say could be the whole Bitcoin debate, Bitcoin versus gold debate. But you note that you don't feel the cryptocurrencies are necessarily the reason that gold can't hold a rally here.
No, 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 no. Listen, you need electricity for a coin, and B, you can't wear it. And more than 60% of gold consumption is jewelry. It's that love trade, and that can't be forgotten. So I don't think so. And I think that the other part is what's really important, Daniela, is crowdfunding. That is so much easier to open up an account and trade these coins 24/7 than it is to open up an account at Schwab or TD Waterhouse and trade stocks. And there's all these limitations. And I think that that's why the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ are piling tons of money into blockchain technology. They made, especially New York Stock Exchange and USAA Insurance Company, made a substantial investment in 2015 in Coinbase when it had a valuation of 75 million, and today it's got a valuation of 1.7 billion. It is easier, anyone will tell you, to open an account there to trade a currency, and you can arbitrage, etc. So I think the crowdfunding is really hurting the stock market, and it is much more significant. Millennials would rather be able to trade in a currency than say gold, unless gold can turn around and go 24 hours. But I would really think it's more, Daniela, it's the stock market.
All right. Well, because I was going to say, someone argued that Bitcoin is energizing some investors, especially millennials, in ways that gold might have a hard time doing.
To a certain degree, but I think that the real hardcore original cryptocurrency buyers believe in gold. They haven't given up on the gold. When you talk to the Genesis Mining Group when they first started their company, the first buyers of these coins in a very ardent way were not millennials, it was gold bugs.
All right. Frank Holmes, thanks so much for joining us. And thanks for watching this edition of Kitco's Gold Report. We'll be back tomorrow.
Okay, so हम लोगों ने देखा डेटा के बारे में हम लोगों ने इस डेटा के बारे में देखा. अब हम लोग आगे आ जाते हैं. एक बार MT4 टर्मिनल पे चले ये, क्योंकि एक बार वापस से हम लोग को 7:44 का टाइम हो रहा है और 7:45 पे एक दूसरी कैंडल फॉर्मेशन का टाइम, उसका मूव देखेंगे और फिर अपने न्यूज़ सेक्शन को डिस्कस करेंगे. सेवनटीन 1731 की रेंज में मार्केट मूव करती है फिलहाल. सो एक दूसरी कैंडल फॉर्म होती हुई हमारी 1734.4849 के लेवल्स पे। और हम लोग आ जाते हैं अपने गोल्ड न्यूज़ सेक्शन पे। तो देख सकते हैं हम लोग सबसे पहले अपना खोलेंगे फॉरेक्स फैक्ट्री कैलेंडर। एंड फॉरेक्स फैक्ट्री कैलेंडर में आज हम लोग देख ले तो आज हमारी ट्यूसडे मार्केट 28 ऑफ सितंबर। तो आज हम लोग को जो डेटाज इंपॉर्टेंट देखने वाले थे वो देखने को मिलने वाले थे हमें। यूएसटी के गुड ट्रेड बैलेंस, प्रीलिम होम से वो होलसेल इन्वेंट्रीज मंथ टू मंथ 6:20 पे, जीबीपी का डेटा 6:30 हम लोग को यूएसटी के एफओएमसी मेंबर इवान स्पीक और एचपीआई मंथ टू मंथ। इसके साथ ही 7:30 हम लोग को फेड चेयर पर्स टेस्टिफाइज देखने को मिल रहा है। ओके, सो आई जस्ट मिस्ड इट, बट नो वरीज, आई एम रिफ्रेशिंग इट और देखते हैं कि इसके क्या रिजल्ट्स देखने को मिले। ओके, सो इट्स Fed chairs Pearls testifies and 7:30 एक और हमें डेटा देखने को मिला है जो कि सीबी कंज्यूमर कॉन्फिडेंस है। आई मिस्ड इट, आई डिड अ मिस। तो नेक्स्ट कैंडल इसीलिए हम लोग की बहुत ज़्यादा डाउन आती हुई दिखी। ओके, 1734 पे ओपन हुई, 1736 का हाई बनाई और 1731 तक का लो बनाती हुई दिखी। इम्पैक्ट जो है यहाँ से आते हुए दिख रहा है। सीबी कंज्यूमर कॉन्फिडेंस एक्चुअल ग्रेटर देन फोरकास्ट इज गुड फॉर करेंसी। एक्चुअल लेस देन फोरकास्ट आया जिसकी वजह से थोड़े से अप्स देखने को मिला और वापस से डिप करती हुई मार्केट। अभी 11:10 पे एफओएमसी मेंबर बोमैन स्पीक है और 7:30 की बात करें तो फेड चेयर पॉयल टेस्टिफाइज। तो एक बार इसकी ओवरसाइट पढ़ लेते हैं। 13 मिनट अगो जो हम लोग को देखने को मिला है, वी डिड अ मिस, एक्चुअली आई डिड अ मिस, आई जस्ट फॉरगॉट दैट कि आज हम लोग का 7:30 का डेटा है। दैट्स व्हाई आई मिस दैट, अदरवाइज हम मिस नहीं करते हैं कोई भी डेटा। नो वरीज, क्योंकि फ्लक्चुएशन बहुत बिल्कुल भी देखने को नहीं मिली है। ओके, इट्स स्टिल लाइव।
Suppress the speed of the recovery and present substantial barriers to a vibrant economy. Still, I remain optimistic about the medium-term trajectory of our economy, and I expect we will return to full employment next year. A rebound like this was never a foregone conclusion. In fact, the American recovery is stronger than those of other wealthy nations. One key factor for our overperformance is the policy choices that Congress has made over the past 18 months. Those choices include the passage of the CARES Act, the Consolidated Appropriations Act, and the American Rescue Plan. Treasury, as you know, was tasked with administering a large portion of the relief dollars in those bills. And when we last met, our department was busy standing up programs to help individual families, state governments, and organizations of every size in between. While we still have much more work to do, we have made significant progress, and I wanted to give you an update. Let's start with families. In July, our department started sending the monthly expanded child tax credit payments to the families of nearly 60 million children across the country. To date, $46 billion in payments have been made, and we're already seeing the impact. Analysis by the Census Bureau found that after the first payments in July, food insecurity among families with children dropped 24%. As for state, local, tribal, and territorial governments, COVID-19 decimated their budgets. There were mass layoffs, and to end the health and economic emergencies, we knew that communities would need funding to hire educators to bring kids back to school, for example, or frontline workers to administer the vaccine. The American Rescue Plan included $350 billion to that end, and those dollars are indeed helping the machinery of local governments get up and running. States and localities can rely on relief money that's available instead of resorting to painful budget cuts. Congress rightly designed the state and local program with flexibility in mind. I think many of us knew the recovery could run up against unforeseen challenges, and we wanted communities to be able to devote resources where and when they saw fit. I want to note that this flexibility is paying off now, especially with the spread of the Delta variant. Harris County, Texas, for instance, has used this funding to boost its immunization rate, offering $100 to each person who gets their first vaccine dose. For the relief dollars not yet out the door, Treasury is doing everything it can to expedite their delivery. The Emergency Rental Assistance Program is one example. Prior to the pandemic, there was essentially no national infrastructure to get money from government coffers to renters and landlords. Building that infrastructure has been a massive undertaking for states, localities, and tribes. The program is scaling up quickly, with 1.4 million payments made to help struggling renters keep a roof over their heads. Still, too much of the money remains bottlenecked at the state and local levels. That's why our Treasury team has worked to eliminate every piece of red tape possible in order to ensure more payments can get to renters and landlords. But states and localities must also work to remove barriers that can speed up distribution of rental assistance funds. I'll end my remarks there, except to say this. It is imperative that Congress address the debt limit. If not, our current estimate is that Treasury will likely exhaust its extraordinary measures by October 18th. At that point, we expect Treasury would be left with very limited resources that would be depleted quickly. America would default for the first time in history. The full faith and credit of the United States would be impaired, and our country would likely face a financial crisis and economic recession as a result. We must address this issue to honor commitments made by this and prior Congresses, including those made to address the health and economic impact of the pandemic. It's necessary to avert a catastrophic event for our economy. Senators, the debt ceiling has been raised or suspended 78 times since 1960, almost always on a bipartisan basis. My hope is that we can work together to do so again and to build a stronger American economy for future generations. Thank you, and I'm pleased to take your questions.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Chair Powell, you're recognized. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Toomey, and other members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss the measures we have taken to address the hardship wrought by the pandemic. Since we last met, the economy has continued to strengthen. Real GDP rose at a robust pace in the first half of the year, and growth is widely expected to continue at a strong pace in the second half. The sectors most adversely affected by the pandemic have improved in recent months, but the rise in COVID-19 cases has slowed their recovery. Household spending rose at an especially rapid pace over the first half of the year, but flattened out in July and August as spending softened in COVID-sensitive sectors. Additionally, in some industries, near-term supply constraints are restraining activity. As with overall economic activity, conditions in the labor market have continued to improve. Demand for labor is very strong, and job gains averaged 750,000 per month over the past 3 months. In August, however, gains slowed markedly, with the slowdown concentrated in sectors most sensitive to the pandemic. The unemployment rate was 5.2% in August, and this figure understates the shortfall in employment, particularly as participation in the labor market has not moved up from the low rates that have prevailed for most of the past year. Factors related to the pandemic appear to be weighing on employment growth. These factors should diminish with progress on containing the virus. The downturn has not fallen equally on all Americans, and those least able to shoulder the burden have been hardest hit. In particular, despite progress, joblessness continues to fall disproportionately on lower wage workers in the service sector and on African Americans and Hispanics. Inflation is elevated and will likely remain so in coming months before moderating. As the economy continues to reopen, we are seeing upward pressure on prices, particularly due to supply bottlenecks in some sectors. These effects have been larger and longer lasting than anticipated, but they will abate, and as they do, inflation is expected to drop back toward our longer-run 2% goal. The process of the reopening of the economy is unprecedented. As it continues, bottlenecks, hiring difficulties, and other constraints could again prove to be greater and more enduring than anticipated, posing upside risks to inflation. If sustained higher inflation were to become a serious concern, we would certainly respond and use our tools to ensure levels that are consistent with our goal. The path of the economy continues to depend on the course of the virus, and risks to the outlook remain. The Delta variant has led to a surge in cases, causing human suffering and slowing the recovery. Continued progress on vaccinations would support a return to more normal economic conditions. The Fed's policy actions are guided by our dual mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices, along with our responsibilities to promote the stability of the financial system. In response to the crisis, we took broad and forceful measures to support the flow of credit and to promote the stability of the financial system. Our actions taken together helped unlock more than $2 trillion of funding to support businesses large and small, nonprofits, and state and local governments between April and December of 2020. This helped organizations from shuttering and put employers in a better position to keep workers on and to hire them back as the recovery continues. These programs have served as a backstop to key credit markets and helped to restore the flow of credit from private lenders. We have deployed them to an unprecedented extent. Our emergency lending tools require the approval of Treasury and are available only in unusual and exigent circumstances, such as those brought on by the crisis. Many of these programs were supported by CARES Act funding. Those facilities provided essential support through a very difficult year and are now closed. The Fed completed its sales of assets from the secondary market corporate credit fund on August 31. We were able to wind down the facility rapidly and efficiently with no adverse impact on credit conditions. We also recently closed the PPP LF to new lending and are managing the pay down of assets in our other CARES facilities as they wind down. We continue to analyze their efficacy and to review the lessons learned. The Fed's actions affect communities, families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do is in the service of our public mission. We will do all we can to support the economy for as long as it takes. Thank you. Mr. Chair, if I may just offer one thing. What I said last week was that we had all but met the test for tapering. I made it clear that we are, in my view, a long way from meeting the test for maximum employment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, last night my Republican colleagues blocked efforts to provide critical disaster relief to millions of Americans, to keep the government open and to raise the debt ceiling so that the government can pay our bills on time, something we've always done bipartisanly, including right after the Republicans passed their deficit-busting corporate tax giveaway via reconciliation. Be brief, if you would. What would be the impact on our economy if they block all efforts to raise the debt ceiling?
Chairman Brown, failing to increase the debt limit would have catastrophic economic consequences. It would cause the government to default on its obligations, which is an utterly unprecedented event in American history. It would be disastrous for the American economy, for global financial markets, and for millions of families and workers whose financial security would be jeopardized by delayed payments. For example, nearly 50 million seniors would or could stop receiving Social Security payments or see them delayed. Our troops would not know when their paychecks would come. 30 million families who rely on the child tax credit would not receive the monthly payment on time. Unemployment would surely rise. And as we saw in 2011, even coming very close to the deadline without raising the debt ceiling can undermine the confidence of financial markets in the creditworthiness of the United States. It led to a debt debt downgrade and soaring interest rates, which ends up raising payments on mortgages, auto loans, and credit cards.
Thank you. You made clear that the debt ceiling is about money we've already spent, like the CARES Act, that Republicans in Congress voted for and that President Trump signed into law. And now they want to run out and pay the bill. We know it's just wrong. They know it's just wrong. Chair Powell, the most recent jobs report saw, as you point out, saw unemployment decreasing generally, but it also showed a continued racial unemployment gap, and the unemployment is rising for black workers. You committed an erring on the side of lower unemployment and a more competitive labor market. Thank you for that. But last week you announced that policy tightening will begin in November with tapering, that interest rate targets will increase next year. Why take away economic support just when workers are getting back on their feet and starting to see glimmers of real wage growth and when the recovery has failed to reach so many black workers?
Right now we're buying $120 billion worth of securities every month, and all of those purchases add to accommodation. They're increasing accommodation. And we had set a test for beginning to taper those purchases of substantial further progress towards our statutory goals. We haven't met that yet, but as I mentioned, I think we've all but met it on the path that we're looking at. We would continue to add accommodation, not subtract it, until well into the middle of next year. And we think that's appropriate given the strength of the economy. The test for raising interest rates is substantially higher. And, we want to see, just as you indicated at the beginning, we want to see a labor market that you both indicated, a labor market that's very strong. We want to see the kinds of reductions in disparities and the kind of things that we did see before the pandemic arrived.
Thank you. Secretary Yellen, the conservative Niskanen Center said the expansion of the child tax credit would result in billions of dollars in spending, hundreds of thousands of jobs in local communities, particularly rural communities. We know raising a child is work, and most of the parents getting CTC are really doing two jobs at home and in the paid labor force. So set the record straight briefly, if you would. Does the expanded child tax credit, particularly a fully refundable child tax credit, does it increase labor force participation and boost local economies?
I believe that it does. I think the evidence shows that very strongly, that it helps parents take care of their children. As I mentioned in my opening statement, we have seen that hunger, the number of families that don't feel their children don't have enough to eat, drops substantially after the first round of payments. We see that parents are using the CTC payments to pay for basic needs, including food and clothing. And, of course, it can be used for childcare and provide the kind of support that enables parents to take jobs.
And thank you. Sorry to interrupt. Thank you for the way that you and Treasury have gotten those checks out monthly starting in July. Thank you for that. Last question. Chair Powell, the New York Times reported in February only two out of 417 economists employed by the Board of Governors, 2 out of 417 are black. I appreciate you made the diversity at the Fed a priority. I agree with what you said in that article. Institutions that focus on diversity and do it well are the successful institutions in our society. Cutting it even closer, over its 108-year history, no black woman has ever served in the Board of Governors, not one ever. Do you think the Board of Governors would be a more successful institution if black women had a voice and a seat at the table? Should we make that a priority?
I would strongly agree that we want everybody's voice heard around the table, and that would certainly include black women. And we of course have no role in the selection process, but would certainly welcome.
Secretary Yellen, do you agree with that? That it's time we had a black woman on the Board of Governors?
I do. I think diversity is extremely important, and that would certainly be a very welcome achievement.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me begin by just stating the obvious. If the government goes on a spending binge, that will certainly require more borrowing to pay for all that spending. Our Democrats have a spending binge underway. They are threatening to dramatically expand that. And if they get their way, that will certainly necessarily involve more borrowing than we would otherwise need. The Democrats have chosen to ignore our warnings about this excessive spending, but they want us to vote to raise the debt ceiling in order to permit the massive spending increases that they're planning. I would just remind everyone, just as the Democrats have the procedural ability to pass this spending on their own, as they intend to, they have the exact same procedural ability to raise the debt ceiling on their own, which they inevitably will have to end up doing. Mr. Powell, earlier this year, there were certainly sectors of our economy, especially the price-sensitive, the sectors sensitive to reopening, experienced pretty dramatic but largely temporary price spikes. It seems to me now we're seeing a broader, more troubling kind of inflation. Input prices are soaring across the board: raw materials, electrical components, energy, and consumer expectations seem to have internalized this. The New York Fed's most recent survey shows that they expect 5.2% inflation over the coming year. Despite this and all the growth that we've talked about, as you point out, the Fed is still buying $120 billion in securities every month. And I guess my question is, doesn't the inflation we're seeing now seem broader and more structural in nature than the brief blip we saw, say, in used car prices earlier this year?
Yes, I think it's fair to say that it is. Mainly what we've seen is that the supply side restrictions that are so much at the heart of the inflation we're seeing have not only not gotten better, they've actually, in some cases, gotten worse. Look at the car companies. Look at the ships dock, or with the anchors down outside of Los Angeles. And this is really a mismatch between demand and supply, and we need those supply blockages to alleviate, to abate, before inflation can come down. We do believe that it will, but however, if you look at measured inflation and what's contributing to it, most of it is still from a very small category of items.
But it's considerably broader than it was. And I would also point out, and I know you're aware of this, but the Fed's projections of inflation have consistently been off. They've consistently been low. And at some point, I think we need to acknowledge that this is not playing out the way I think the Fed had hoped. Let me shift the topic to a central bank digital currency. So I'm increasingly intrigued by the opportunities that a properly designed central bank digital currency could provide to the U.S. To name a few, instant zero-cost payments, interoperability and programmability with smart contracts, international competitiveness all come to mind. But getting the design correct, getting it right, is essential. For instance, the privacy of Americans has to be respected. We shouldn't design a central bank digital dollar that allows the government to spy on Americans' every transaction. And the Fed is certainly not suited to be a retail bank, and so we certainly shouldn't try to turn it into one. In my view, privately issued digital currencies should be able to coexist with a digital dollar if we go down that road. And private sector developers certainly should be able to innovate either on or in an interoperable fashion with a digital dollar. So I'm not asking you to opine on any of these things, but it seems to me the decision about whether or not to go down this road is transformational, and there are very, very important and sensitive design issues that would have to be resolved. So I think that ought to be done in a transparent process with political accountability, which is to say with congressional input. Could you comment on how important you think it is to have congressional authorization if we're going to go down the road of a digital dollar?
I'd be glad to. And by the way, I agree. This is critical work that we want to take forward. So the laws that were the relevant parts of our law were written long before digital finance was a thing, and a central bank digital currency could take many forms. It is possible that under some forms you'd be able to make an argument that it would be authorized under current law. But I think this is such a fundamental issue. It would be ideal if this were to be a product of broad consultation and ultimately authorizing legislation from Congress.
Thank you. Madam Secretary, I want to talk about the tax agreement. As you know, Pillar 1 will fundamentally rewrite how profits are allocated among countries and will cede U.S. taxing rights to foreign jurisdictions to some degree. Well, current bilateral treaties would need to be modified to implement this reallocation. And obviously, this requires a treaty to implement, right? In fact, the international agreement itself, I think it acknowledges that by referring to a multilateral instrument, layman's terms, that's a treaty, and that'll be necessary for this implementation. So do you acknowledge that Pillar 1 requires a treaty and therefore a Senate ratification in order to implement it?
I believe there are a number of ways in which Congress could implement it, but certainly ratification of a treaty would be one way in which Congress could authorize, and certainly Congress has to authorize the transfer of taxing rights that's contemplated in Pillar 1.
Well, I'll finish, Mr. Chairman, but I want to stress that we have for many, many decades had bilateral tax treaties that govern the amounts and the manner by which foreign governments can tax American companies. Changing those treaties requires ratification in the Senate. There's no way around that I can see. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Toomey. Senator Tester is recognized from his office.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to welcome both Chairman Powell and Secretary Yellen. This first question is for you, Secretary Yellen. Through the American Rescue Plan, I have fought for and we got targeted relief for local communities and states. I've heard some concerns that in Montana, some of the funds that you've already gotten out from Treasury to the states specifically aren't getting out for projects. And that proposes some problems, especially with winter coming on in Montana, that we might miss an opportunity to make upgrades to broadband or other critical investments. I have heard some folks in Montana leadership blaming this confusion that's caused by the Treasury Department because the funding is coming in two tranches. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So Secretary Yellen, beyond the restrictions on uses of these funds provided by Congress and through Treasury's guidance, is there anything that the Treasury Department is doing which would prevent states like Montana from receiving the funds in two tranches and using the funds that they have already received now?
Senator, there's no restriction that Montana faces in using the funds that have been allocated or making plans to use the funds that will be made available in the second tranche. That can be done. That can be done now. There's absolutely no need to wait.
Okay, so they can use that first tranche right now. No need to wait because your mic was on and off there for a minute.
Yes, that's right.
Thank you. Do they need your approval to start planning what they might use the rest of the funds for? And to clarify, states with split payments do not need Treasury's approval to start getting the funds that they've already have out the door. That's correct, just to make it absolutely clear.
That's correct, and they can plan how they intend to use the second tranche of funds as well. They can begin doing that now.
On the second tranche, do you have a timeline for getting the funds to municipalities and states who have received these split payments?
I believe it's a year lag that between the payments.
Okay. It is my understanding that the process for these funds has worked just as Congress laid them out, and it's been pretty predictable. Would you say that is correct?
Yes, I think it is correct.
Okay. And then can you talk to me about the impact that you're seeing in the communities as program funds through the coronavirus state and local fiscal relief fund are getting up and running?
Well, I think we're already seeing a significant impact of these funds. Some of it is being used for immediate pandemic response, vaccination efforts, helping unemployed workers, supporting small businesses, and some of it is being used to address longer-term needs, including broadband infrastructure, water, and sewer. And so these funds can serve a variety of needs and are doing so.
Okay. Secretary Yellen, I want you to respond to something the ranking member said, and I think he knows better, but he said that Democrats want the Republicans to expand the debt limit so that they can spend money. Is it not true that the debt limit is expanded because of money that is already spent? That it would be similar to you going down to a restaurant, ordering a steak dinner, paying for it on your credit card, and when the credit card comes back, you would say, nope, I'm not paying for it. Isn't that similar to what we're talking about with the debt limit?
That is absolutely correct. It has nothing to do with future programs of payments. It is entirely about paying bills that have already been incurred by this Congress and previous Congresses, and it's about making good on past commitments, as you said, paying our credit card bill.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Thanks, Senator Tester. Senator Shelby from Alabama is recognized.
Thank you. Welcome, both of you, Madam Secretary, and Chairman Powell. Chairman Powell, I'll direct my first question to you. The Phillips curve is an economic concept that represents an inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. Historically, it's been utilized to understand the relationship between unemployment and inflation, particular in relation to the Federal Reserve's dual mandate of price stability and maximum employment. You're very aware of this, Mr. Chairman. Some economists question the current validity of this concept as the connection between inflation and unemployment has seemed to grow weaker in recent years. Chairman Powell, is the Phillips curve still a valid economic model or tool, and have you observed any notable strengthening in the relationship between unemployment and inflation during the pandemic?
Senator, if you go back to the high inflation area that we both recall, there was a very close relationship, a one-for-one kind of relationship, or close to it, between unemployment and inflation. That is no longer the case. There is still a relationship, but we say the Phillips curve is very flat, but it's not completely flat. So there is a relatively modest relationship. The slope of the line is 7 degrees or something, so very flat. Is there any change that we observe in the near term? To get to your last question, not at this point, no.
Do you watch the Phillips curve?
Well, we do, but if you saw, we had 3.5% unemployment and very modest inflation for a couple of years before the pandemic. So it's really not a top of mind concern. The inflation that we're having is, but it's really not related to the Phillips curve.
Would you say that the Phillips curve concept is not valid right now?
It's not particularly binding right now. Inflation is high and the unemployment rate is high, so it's not really the binding constraint.
Okay. I'll direct this question to the Secretary. The stepped-up basis, Madam Secretary, is a tax provision that allows for a beneficiary to adjust the basis of an asset to its current value rather than its value when originally purchased. We know that. This provision allows for beneficiaries to avoid paying high taxes on assets that have increased over time, largely due to inflation. President Biden's American Families Plan includes a proposal to eliminate the stepped-up basis. A lot of people believe that such a change would result in a costly tax increase on family-owned businesses, particularly on farms and ranches. According to a study by the Texas A&M Agriculture and Food Policy Center, 98% of the farms in its 30-state database will be impacted by the Biden administration's proposal. The study calculates that the average additional tax liability per farm to be over $720,000. Madam Secretary, do you support eliminating stepped-up basis for state beneficiaries? And if you do, why?
Senator Shelby, I do support eliminating stepped-up basis. The reason is that a very large share of the income of wealthy individuals is simply never taxed. individuals hold on to these assets during their lifetime. That income is never taxed. And we know that for some of the wealthiest individuals in the country, they pay very low taxes overall because most of their income takes the form of unrealized capital gains. The Biden administration proposed that at death, those gains be taxed, and with careful consideration, not in any way to harm the prospects of family-owned farms or small businesses. There were substantial exemptions to protect them. Even if there is not actually taxation imposed at death, getting rid of stepped-up basis would mean that an heir would inherit.
हम लोग लाइव स्पीच को इसलिए देख रहे हैं क्योंकि लाइव स्पीच का पूरी तरीके से इम्पैक्ट पड़ेगा हमारे गोल्ड मार्केट पे। एक बार हम लोग गोल्ड मार्केट का मूव देखते हैं तो देख सकते हैं पूरी तरीके से अप निकलती हुई मार्केट 1739.40 तक की लेवल्स वापस से दिखाती हुई मिली है, जस्ट बिकॉज की न्यूज़ में मूवमेंट हम लोग को देखने को मिल रही है, इसीलिए हम लोग इस इम्पोर्टेंट न्यूज़ को डिस्कस करें यहाँ पे।
The original basis of the asset, and when that person eventually sold the asset, taxes would be paid. But I regard step-up of basis as a kind of loophole that allows a very large portion of income in this country of the wealthiest individuals to go untaxed.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Warner is recognized from his office. Remote.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to go back and revisit with Treasury Secretary some of the concerns we all share about potential default. I think many of us, I know the chairman and the ranking member were around when in 2011 our nation got close to that kind of default. Madam Secretary, and I particularly worry about some of my colleagues who are concerned rightfully about additional mandatory spending, but if we were to go into this default basis, would it not be expected that would cause a lack of faith in the American government's ability to meet its obligations, which in all likelihood would result in a interest rate spike? And is my math basically correct that if there were a 100 basis point increase in interest rates, 1% increase in interest rates, when we're looking at a $27 trillion debt, you're looking at more than a $200 billion a year additional mandatory interest payment. Those interest payments, because of that spike in interest rates, comes before payment of Social Security, payment of our military, any of our other priorities. And if you extrapolate that on a 10-year basis for concerns about spending, couldn't that be close to an additional $2 trillion over 10 years of mandatory spending? Is there, Madam Secretary, anything faulty with that analogy or my math?
I don't believe there's anything. I don't believe there's anything at all faulty about the math. I think there's no question, but that if Congress were to fail to raise the debt limit, or even if it was feared, if we're getting close, and it looks as in 2011 like Congress might not raise the debt ceiling and we might not be able to pay our bills, that you would expect to see an interest rate spike. And if the debt ceiling were not raised, I think there would be a financial crisis and a calamity. And absolutely, it's true that the interest payments on the government debt would increase. I would be concerned that the dollar and treasury assets, which are regarded as the most secure in the world and serve as the basis for the dollar to be the reserve currency, that it would undermine confidence in the dollar as a reserve currency. And the interest payments of ordinary Americans on their mortgages and on their cars and on their credit cards would all go up in line with higher Treasury borrowing costs, and it would increase our spending, absolutely.
And again, this is not something that you could then reverse if suddenly Congress came to its senses. Once you saw any kind of spike in interest rates or confidence losing, once this genie's out of the bottle, there's no putting it back in. Is that correct?
I think that's correct. This would be a manufactured crisis we had imposed on this country, which has been going through a very difficult period, is on the road to recovery, and it would be a self-inflicted wound of enormous proportions.
And we all know that we are in an economic competition with China. Would not this effort in terms of a China that's trying to criticize our withdrawal from Afghanistan and would not this give additional fodder to the Chinese arguments and as you mentioned undermining the confidence in the dollar as a reserve currency? Wouldn't this action potentially also give more credibility to China's efforts to try to make the RMB an equal to or potentially even more of a default reserve currency?
Well, certainly it would undermine confidence in our government and in the role of the dollar and the safety of the dollar, which has really never been questioned. The dollar is the safe haven asset when times are turbulent that people feel is absolutely secure. I think China has a long ways to go in reforming its financial markets before the renminbi is a serious rival to the dollar as a reserve currency. But I can't think of anything more harmful to the role of the dollar than failing to raise the debt ceiling.
Again, I know my time's up, but I would just point out to my colleagues that are rightfully concerned about mandatory spending, that interest rate spike and again, 100 basis points roughly is $200 billion a year. My math says that's $2 trillion over 10. That would be spending we don't need to do, and we can all avoid that taking place. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Warner. Senator Kennedy from Louisiana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Madam Secretary and Mr. Chairman, for being here. Madam Secretary, when you were here last, and we all look forward to you coming, I asked you to tell me what you thought inflation would be at the end of this year, and you told me 2%. Do you still stand by that prediction?
Clearly, inflation this year is going to be above 2%. Just the experience so far.
ओके सो यहाँ पे हम लोग को न्यूज़ देखने को मिली। अभी हम लोगों ने क्या देखा कि इन्फ्लेशन 2% से अप हो सकती है। ये डेटा जैसे ही आया मार्केट में देख सकते हैं गोल्ड हमारा वापस से डाउन होते हुए, क्योंकि इन्फ्लेशन बढ़ते हुए दिखेगा तो वापस से गोल्ड एक बार डिप करते हुए दिखेगा, जिसकी वजह से वापस से 1732 के लेवल्स हम लोग इसीलिए डिस्कस कर रहे हैं इसको क्योंकि पूरी तरीके से गोल्ड का मूव इसी पे डिपेंड कर रहा है। और जैसे ही इन्फ्लेशन की बात आती हुई दिखी है, देख सकते हैं 1732 1731 के लेवल्स वापस से रेडार पे आते हुए दिख रहे हैं। सो हम लोग बाकी की चीज़ें अपने नेक्स्ट सेशन में डिस्कस करेंगे। फिलहाल अभी का सेशन हम लोग एंड कर रहे हैं और वापस से मिलेंगे 10 मिनट बाद दूसरे सेशन में। सो तब तक के लिए थैंक यू सो मच और वापस से रिज्वाइन करिएगा 10 मिनट बाद। थैंक यू सो मच फॉर ज्वाइनिंग।